Today we're going to talk about Walter's new book. This is his 8th book, like his other books, it's an extraordinarily detail-oriented book. You can't really, wait to finish it. You can't really put it down and not pick it up again. It's a terrific book, and I have really enjoyed working through it and understanding it. A lot of it was some technology. I'm not as technology-oriented as maybe you are, but let's go through the book if we can and the background of it. So you were considering doing this book for a number of years, and then you got a call from Steve Jobs who said, do a book about me.
Right.
So
his humility sort of impressed me.
So he said, you did a book about Albert Einstein, so what about a book about me? Right? So you did, and you interrupted the book, your work on the Innovators, right? So how much time had you done before the Jobs book on this, and then how did you have to pick it up again?
You know, I was gathering string ever since I became the editor of digital media at Time Inc. in 1992-93. And that was right when we were all on online services, which you remember, the AOLs and CompuServes. And the World Wide Web was just coming up. They had just invented the web browser. And I was trying to convince the folks at Time Inc. to go directly to the web, to the internet. And so Reg Brack, who was the president of Time Inc., said, well, who owns the internet? And I thought, well, that's a really clueless question. And then I said, nobody owns it. He said, well, who built it? And I realized I didn't know all of these things. But as I was there doing new media and running Time a little bit later, you get to spend time with Gordon Moore, or Andy Grove, or Mark Andreessen, or Tim Berners-Lee. So I was gathering notes on the whole thing. Then I talked to Bill Gates, because I wanted to interview him about it, and he kept pushing me and said, it isn't just the creation of the internet, it's a simultaneous creation of the internet and the personal computer that's like the steam engine and loom creating the industrial revolution 100 years earlier. And obviously, when I put it aside to do Steve Jobs, I realized that the connections of the computer, personal computer, microchip, transistor, and internet, how they all gelled to become a revolution, that was the narrative.
Okay, so you spent, let's say, a couple years before the Steve Jobs book, and then after the Steve Jobs book, you spent another couple years doing it, would you say? So total time you took in research was how much, would you say?
Oh, I mean, it was sort of gathering string over 15 years, but I don't know if I don't bill by the hour.
All right, so how much time did it take you to write it? How much time did it take to write it?
2 years.
2 years. And I'm curious, for people who haven't written 8 books before and who also have a day job, how do you run the Aspen Institute and also write books? Do you write them in the morning? Do you write them at night? How do you do that?
Well, first of all, Eric runs the Aspen Institute.
Okay, all right.
Secondly, I write at night. I got cured of watching television by having worked at CNN.
Okay.
When I left CNN, we actually cut the cord, so I didn't, watch a lot of TV. And so usually at about 9 at night, as you know, Kathy, she's like a morning person, so she's in bed by 9:30 if she can be.
I don't know that as much as you might know, but okay.
There you do. But, from 9 at night till 1 in the morning, there's a lot of time. So I try to write for 4 hours a night.
You're not tired then?
No. But I also don't, as people here will attest, I don't get here like at 8 in the morning. I get here around 10.
Okay.
And, there's no real reason to have a think tank start thinking before 10 a.m. No thought has ever been useful if conceived before 10 a.m.
All right. So you wrote the book over a 2-year period of time. And I'm just curious, when you wrote the book, when you were doing the research, you had to meet a number of the individuals. You have about 60 different individuals who talk about in the book. Some were deceased. Some I don't know if they actually met with you. How many of the people that you wrote about were alive and you were actually able to get to meet?
Well, I would say 3/4 of the people were still alive. People like Gordon Moore. Obviously, I missed meeting Bob Noyce, who was pretty awesome. I'm lucky in many, many ways, one of which is my job at the Aspen Institute, which, as you notice, is not a full, I get to come in at 10. But another reason I'm lucky is if you're at the Aspen Institute or you've been at Time magazine or you've written books like I have, if you call somebody and say, I'm going to put you in a book, they say, fine, I want to talk to you. I mean, I don't have problems getting people to want to sit down, whereas somebody, you know, and other writers, it's a little harder to get your phone calls returned. So I realized that's a lucky thing in my life, and I try to make use of it. I try to go drive up the mountains in, you know, Silicon Valley and find these people and sit down with them.
So of the people you did meet, you were able to interview, if you could say which one was the most impressive, or the one who you most were pleased that you actually had the time to spend with because you didn't really know them before, know much about them, was there one or two people that were so outstanding that you really were just blown away by their abilities?
Yeah, Gordon Moore. Most of you know Moore's Law, which is that the speed and processing power of microchips doubles approximately every 18 months or so. Gordon Moore is one of those people who is both a visionary. I mean, he really got how microchips were going to transform all society, but he also was able to execute on vision, because vision without execution is sort of hallucination. This guy creates Intel with Bob Noyce, and he lives in Woodside, California, in a sort of, you know, house way up in the woods. And he is just so gentle. He loves giving credit more than claiming credit. And when you ask him a question, he really sort of wrestles through and thinks through all the ramifications. So I love spending time with him. And, you know, he became sort of a symbol, like Bob Noyce is, of the good people in this book, J.C.R. Licklider. People I had barely heard of, but you barely had heard of them because they loved giving other people credit, but they were able to gather smart people.
So the people you couldn't meet because they either weren't available or they were deceased, is there one that you wish you could have met?
Well, obviously, Ada Lovelace. I'd love to go to the horses and bet on ponies with her. And she was half mad. I can say that because I can say it of her father. Lord Byron was half crazy, too. But that craziness seemed like it made him much more of a visionary. She sort of would look at the punch cards running the looms that her father hated. Her father was a Luddite by defending the followers of Ned Ludd who were smashing the mechanical looms. But she looked at those punch cards and said, they weave beautiful patterns on the looms, and they make the looms with patterns. And she had a friend who was building a numerical calculator and said, with those punch cards you can make a calculator that could do anything, not just do numbers, but do music and words. And so she's so cool and visionary.
So you wish you could have met her. Okay.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, when you were editor of Time, you managed to pick somebody out of all the people who lived in the 20th century as the person of the 20th century. And that person was Albert Einstein. So if you could say there's one person most responsible for the technology that we have today that you cover in your book, is there one person that you would say this person is the most responsible for it, or is that impossible to say?
Yeah, I'm going to give you probably an answer you don't want, which is...
Why don't you answer I'm happy with?
Okay, well, I'll give the true answer and then I'll say. The reason I wrote the book this way is that there is no one person. And those of us who write biographies, Messy Evan back there, we've done it over the years, we know we distort history a little bit. We know we sort of make it sound like there's this one person who, starting in a garage or a garret, had a light bulb moment in the Industrial Revolution or the you know, digital age occurs. And that's not the way history works, as you know, and that's not the way Carlyle Group works or the Aspen Institute works. It actually is a whole lot of people who team and collaborate and hand off to each other things. And so, you know, I'm sure my publisher would have wanted me to answer that question, like, don't do a collective biography, just write about the one person who brings us the computer, or the one person. But I mean, if you could do books, in fact, I do first quarter of this book on the person who invented the computer, and it isn't a single answer like that. I think that makes it more interesting to know how people collaborate and create something.
So if there's a theme to your book, and there are many different themes, but if there's one theme that I took out of it, is that people who collaborate tend to get more done than people who are just sitting by themselves in their office, and that generally a collaboration team needs somebody who's a very creative visionary, but somebody who actually can get things done.
Right.
So as you talk about in your book, the various people like Steve Jobs had a partner in the beginning, Steve Wozniak, and then Bill Gates had Paul Allen, and they all collaborate in different ways. But would you go through that theme about how you came up with the idea that actually there aren't single geniuses coming up with these great ideas by themselves?
One way I came up with that, which obviously is not an original notion, is by trying to answer the question, who invented the computer? And if you're a romantic historian, you sort of glom on this guy, John Vincent Atanasoff in Iowa State, who creates a circuit that uses on-off switches, vacuum tubes electronically, to do logical sequences, and is really the first electronic circuit. And a romantic historian would say in his basement he invents a computer. Now, he doesn't have a team. He's a loner. He has one graduate student, but nobody really working with him. So as he tries to build this thing, he can't get the punch card burners to work because he doesn't have a mechanic, he doesn't have engineers around him, he gets it sort of halfway built, he gets drafted into goes into the Navy, and it's in the basement there, and they need the room, so they disassemble it and throw it away. The only reason he's not lost to history is this opposite guy, a guy named John Mauchly from right up, here in Northwest Washington, Bethesda. His father was at the Carnegie and then the Smithsonian. He was part of that crowd who loves to gather and share ideas in wood-paneled explorers clubs or the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, to which you will be inducted tomorrow. Congratulations. And places like that where people gather and share ideas, like Ben Franklin did with his American Philosophical Society. So Mauchly goes around to the 1939 World's Fair and he sees how they're doing. So he goes up to Vassar where they're actually using electronic circuits to, count, bursts from an electron. He goes to about 22 places, even drives in his car to Iowa State because he's heard of this dude making a computer in the basement. And he takes some of these ideas. Then he comes back to Penn and he says, we need to form a team and create them. So he gets the world's best engineer there, a guy named Presper Eckert. He gets 6 women mathematicians to be his programmers. He gets mechanics and people who have grease under their fingernails, like maybe 120 people, and they make something the size of about 8 times the size of this room, and it's ENIAC. Now he ends up getting sued, or not he, but his patents get challenged. After ENIAC becomes UNIVAC and Unisys, they get sued by the heirs of the people around Atanasoff, the guy from Iowa, because he took the idea. It never fully gets resolved. Nobody actually gets the patent on the computer. But that convinced me that the loner in the basement who's a great visionary but can't execute is relegated to the dustbin of history unless somebody who can execute goes there, takes the ideas, and puts them together.
So another theme of your book, and it's really the theme, I guess, of your speech, your Jefferson lecture at the National Endowment for Humanities, is that art and science really come together in many ways, and you really are better off if you can combine science and technology with some kind of humanistic and artistic feeling. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
The first long interview I had with Steve Jobs, it was actually weirdly New Year's Eve, after he had gone back and forth on whether he wanted to do this book, and I didn't realize he had gotten sick at that time. It was 2008 or 9. He called up and he said, okay, I want to do this book. And then he said, here's the theme of the book. Steve was never very shy. And he said, I was a humanities kid growing up. I love poetry and art. But I was also an electronics geek, and I didn't know which I wanted to be. And then I read something that Edwin Land, who invented Polaroid, said, which is to stand at the intersection of the arts and the sciences. That's where true value is created. People can connect our humanities to our technology. This is the opposite strand of what I will call the Alan Turing strand, which is artificial intelligence. Let's just make really, really great machines, but we don't care about how they connect to us. The Ada Lovelace strand is machines will never be as creative as we are, but combining humans and machinery, humanity and technology, will make for the creativity. So that becomes the theme of the book, which is Ada Lovelace, all the way through all the great artistic people who connect their humanities to technology. Most notably, people you've barely heard of, but Lick Lick Lighter, who does the first interactive computers at MIT, and Doug Engelbart, who invents the mouse, which is a very personal way to connect to your computer, and Alan Kay, who does a graphical user interface at Xerox PARC that Steve borrows or steals or whatever he does for the Macintosh. So the theme is those who can connect humanities and technology win.
Okay, so let me go back to one part of the beginning of the book. In the beginning of the book, you have a long chapter about Ada Lovelace. And recently there's a New York Times article about you, and it said that one time you were trying to get your daughter to write her college essay application. She wouldn't do it, Finally, she went to the room to get rid of her parents and just wrote it. And she came out and said, I wrote it, and you said, what did you write about? And she said, Ada Lovelace. Now, did she get the idea from you, or did you get the idea from her?
No, my response to her was, Ada, who's Ada? And explain to me what she did. I'd vaguely heard of Ada Lovelace, but I had no idea. And then she said, oh, Dad, she invented the computer algorithm, and she's been written out of history like a lot of women geeks. Okay. And so I read about her, and, we're all servants of our children or whatever, but it did become a framing device, that Ada Lovelace, who connects art to technology, who believes in the connection of humans and machines, who understands the beauty of the revolution, she becomes the opening chapter and the final chapter, because her vision, as opposed to the artificial intelligence vision, is what triumphs.
Okay. So you talk about Ada Lovelace, but you also have a chapter in there talking about women programmers, and the fact that when the computer was being developed and they needed programming, and they sort of brought in a lot of women who were good in math and other things like that, Grace Hopper, so forth. Can you explain how women were often relegated to the lesser positions, but how they actually contributed an enormous amount?
Yeah, especially let's take ENIAC, which is the one they're building at the University of Pennsylvania, which is there to calculate missile trajectory so they can have firing tables during World War II. As the war is ending, they realize the machine's got to do other things as well, sonic booms and atomic explosions and all sorts of other calculations, and so it needs to be reprogrammed. And the way to reprogram is you have to unplug the cables and plug it back. You have to know what the innards of the machine do, so it will do different types of problems. Back then, here's the most interesting statistic I stumbled across. I was reading about Grace Hopper, and she had gotten a PhD at Yale in math in the 30s, and somebody had written, the first math PhD from Yale, and I realized, no, a lot of women got math PhDs. More women got PhDs in mathematics in the 1930s, in real numbers, as well as, of course, in percentage, than in the 1950s or 60s. Women were great mathematicians. It was before some of our friends told them that women can't do math as well. We won't go into that one. So I was fascinated by that, but the boys with their toys felt that hardware was the important thing. Actually making this machine in the circuit. And to some extent, programming it was a slightly more menial task, but they get these 6 women of ENIAC and train them to do it in great secrecy, because they're doing, for John von Neumann, whether an implosion bomb will work, so it can't be too public. But when they finally do unveil it to the public in '46, they have this grand dinner at Penn in the great hall there, black tie, front page of the New York Times, ENIAC unveiled, but the women who had done the programming were there for the demonstration, but not invited to the dinner, so they took the bus home that February 14th, Valentine's Day. What happened, though, to answer your question, is it ends up that programming a machine is actually as important and maybe more important than the hardware of the machine. A Univac and a Sperry Rand and a Honeywell, whatever the hardware is somewhat commoditized. It's who wrote the operating system.
So in their book, you point out that I think it was Grace Hopper, maybe one of the other women, they were trying to get the programming to work at one point, and the programming for one of the big computers didn't, and they couldn't figure it out. And so they opened up the innards of the computer, and what did they find?
This was Grace Hopper's team at Harvard, where they're doing the Mark I, and it still had a few electromechanical relays, not just the tubes, and there's a moth in it. So they take out the moth, They put it in the logbook. Whenever there's a problem, you have a logbook. They put the moth in with the Scotch tape. It's still there. And they wrote, we had to debug the machine. And that's why we get the phrase debugging.
Right. So let's go through, if we can, the trajectory of things that you cover in your book, relatively briefly. But you start off by the computer, and you've addressed it a little bit. But what was the obsession in the, let's say, 1800s or so with having a computer? What did people think a computer could do that made them think they should have something that was called a computer? And where did that name come from, by the way?
In the 1800s?
Well, whenever.
Computing was obviously just on numbers. For a while, the computers were actually the humans, if that's what you mean, the women.
Right.
Because they would get women to calculate things. And the Industrial Revolution's greatest invention was not any particular machine, but the notion that you could break things up into tiny little segments, like here's how you make a pen. I mean, that's the Adam Smith pen factory thing. But they would break calculations into little things and get whole rows of women, and they would sort of subtract two, and then they would multiply by 3, and they would do a calculation. So they would call computers. But after a while, especially if you're doing missile trajectories and winning at war, as World War II comes, the build-up to it in 1939, both Germany, United States, and Britain realized that computing power will be just as important as firing power, and that's when they say, okay, let's make some machines that will work with humans to do it.
Okay, so when they were doing that, they realized, as we discussed, that they have to have something that makes the computers work, and that was called programming, and the women often worked on that. But after they did the first computers and they had some of them programmed, the computers were very large because they used vacuum tubes. Now, why did they use vacuum tubes to kind of help the computers work?
Vacuum tubes are just an on-off switch or an amplifier. All the computer does is millions of on-off calculations called Boolean algebra, but you don't have to understand it. It just says if you want to do this logical thing, if you want to paint this picture, it's either or, blah, 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 and you get all the way through a computer program. On-off switches before vacuum tubes were sort of these big old electromechanical things. Those of you old enough to remember an old switchboard, and a phone guy, click, clack, and it would switch on and off. Tommy Flowers and Alan Turing at Bletchley Park secretly breaking the German Enigma code. There's a wonderful movie coming out next month called The Imitation Game about it. They realize, and Tommy Flowers in particular, that if you use vacuum tubes, which are hot, expensive, they burn out, they're a pain, but you can do, it takes an electromechanical switch maybe a half second to do something. It takes a vacuum tube, a billionth of a second, whatever. So you can just really make fast computers. And so the original computers like ENIAC and Colossus at Bletchley Park are these hulking things, very hot, with, I think ENIAC had 7,600 vacuum tubes in it. One of the things that made the women cool is they programmed it so well that when something would go wrong, they had to go to the women and say which one, and they'd tell you which tube was burned out.
All right, well, I can understand that would be better at figuring out how things were broken, I guess, than probably the men. But so what happened is people said the vacuum tubes are so big and they're hot and they break a lot. Why don't we find something that can do this same kind of function but more efficiently? And so at Bell Labs, there was an effort to maybe figure out what they could do better, and they invented something called the transistor. And
a transistor is just the same as a vacuum tube. It's an on-off switch, but they have a solid state group because they want, by solid state they mean, we want something that'll do what a tube does, but we want it to be solid. We don't want it to have a filament and all that sort of stuff. And so you put together, and this is the best example of teams having to do it. Because in Bell Labs, you have this big, wonderful place. They even build it with these huge corridors so people run into each other. You have people like Shannon, and who's an information theorist. Walter Brattain, who's a quantum theorist, as well as Bill Shockley, who's a great physicist. But you also have Walter Brattain, who is an experimentalist, who knows how to dope a piece of silicon, and make it do things. You have material scientists. You even have people who've climbed poles to amplify phone signals and have grease under their fingernails and know how amplifiers work. So they all get together, and for a year and a half, they have a solid state group. And what they're trying to do, and everything we do today, every piece of device you have on you now that's doing something, is based on these on-off switches. And this is why we should understand and love our technology. But what they figure out is that if you take a piece of silicon it's called a semiconductor, meaning unlike copper, which is a good conductor, or glass, which is a good resistor, it can go either way. And if you dope it by putting an impurity in it, boron or anything else, you can make it be better or worse of a semiconductor. And finally, if you just screw it up all these ways and you sort of imagine the way the electrons are dancing in the surface state, you can make it a brilliant on-off switch that's so small you can barely see. And so finally, in 1946, they invent, all of them, the transistor, which is just a way to do in a tiny piece of silicon, or they used another semiconductor, but it becomes silicon eventually. This thing that makes a computer no longer this big hulking thing, but something you can put in your pocket.
Well, in that era, there weren't a lot of venture capitalists. People weren't thinking of making great riches by discovering great things or inventing great things. They wanted academic credit. They wanted the attention of their peers. So as you describe in your book, there were Brattain and John Bardeen and William Shockley. And Shockley was the boss of Bardeen and Brattain. So Brattain and Bardeen come up with something that essentially becomes the transistor, and Shockley is upset that he isn't involved in the invention that could win a Nobel Prize, which ultimately did. So what did he do about that?
Well, first of all, he inserts himself as both in the patenting process and even insists that when Bell Labs has its press conference, and every single photograph of Bell Labs has to not just have Bardeen and Brattain, but has to have Shockley in it. And when they're doing the big photograph that's going to be in the New York Times, they're all posing in front of the microscope. And right before they take the picture, he sits down at the desk and holds the microscope as if he's the one doing it, which drives the other two nuts, but also gets into the question of collaboration in the digital age. Because sometimes it works great, like the people who do the internet, they all love sharing credit, but in the end there's a tension between wanting to either get the intellectual property or the patent or the Nobel Prize or the glory, and willing to be a teamwork and collaborative. And that tension is kind of cool.
So, of course, people who live in Washington wouldn't be familiar with taking credit for things that they didn't do. But, so this is an foreign kind of concept. But ultimately, they
aren't familiar with collaboration and teamwork either. So it's all foreign to them.
So ultimately, the three of them do win the Nobel Prize, right? But they hadn't talked to each other for years, and so they show up in the Nobel ceremony.
Yeah, they kind of forget. Bardeen and Brattain have remained friends, but it's Shockley. And as you probably know, Shockley also is a bit paranoid by this point, and eventually becomes quite racist and believes that, IQ, intelligence, and so he's got some personality traits that make him not only claiming credit, but very resentful, paranoid. He made people in his new company make lie detector tests to see who had left a thumbtack on it. He was nuts. But they do get together, and I think the Nobel, I've never won one, but and we lost out again today. But I think getting there and being at the Nobel dinner, it sort of reduces tension for a little while. They all have a wonderful dinner.
So the transistor is invented. For the average person in the United States, how was the transistor helping them? Was there any products that came out to make the transistor?
Well, besides making innovations, if you really want to be successful as an innovator, you got to make a product.
Right.
So Bell Labs doesn't quite have these are important things. They have the copyright patent on it, but they license it promiscuously to anybody who wants to use it. It doesn't make a huge impact. Bell doesn't quite know what to do with it. But a guy down at Texas Instruments gets a license to do it, has to convince Bell to sell them a license, because they're saying, you're an oil exploration company that's now trying to turn yourself into an instrument company. And he says, only if we make a real product out of it. And he's sort of a Steve Jobs type. He doesn't do a focus group to say, what are people asking for? He just comes up with the idea that if I make a transistor radio, it will make a device that's more personal out of a device that isn't personal now. Now, I'm not old enough, you're not old enough to remember when radios were appliances in the living room, but I am old enough to remember when I got my first transistor radio.
About this big?
No, they were even small. I think a little bit smaller. You could put them in your pocket. Regency made them like an iPod. They came in 4 colors. They were simple to use. Little track wheel, so you just got on WTIX, which was the AM station in New Orleans. And it came, and this is where you really have great synergies in life, like the automobile industry and the petroleum industry being synergistic. Regency, the first transistor radio, is released by Texas Instruments. the exact month that Elvis Presley records his first rock album. Now, in some ways, those are weirdly synergistic because so many kids are told you can't be listening to this music, so they want their pocket radios, they can take it to the beach or the backyard or to their things. And Elvis Presley and rock probably couldn't have arisen if there hadn't been personal radios. So one of the themes is this synergy. The other theme is that our devices become more and more personal. They aren't big computers in a room, they're things you can put in your pocket.
So the next step in your evolution of this technology revolution is the development of something called the microchip. And the microchip was more or less, and your book describes, invented almost simultaneously by two different groups. One at somebody at Texas Instruments, and one at a company that had been set up after Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left, working for Shockley. So can you describe how they came up with it almost simultaneously and what a microchip actually is?
They come up with it simultaneously and from different angles. Texas Instruments is the company I said who first did the transistor. They're looking for better ways to make transistor, and they realize that you can have a process to etch a whole lot of transistors on a chip. There was a particular problem making things with lots of little transistors because you had all these little wires that didn't work. Well, if you etched them all in a chip, you didn't need to do that. Same time, same period, Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce have a problem because their transistors aren't working very well. So they come up with a way to put a coating, like an icing on the cake, and etch the transistor under. And say, well, if you do that, you can etch a whole lot of them on. So almost simultaneously, they come up with the microchip. What it is simply a way to etch lots and lots of transistors on one small chip of silicon. And Moore's law, Gordon Moore, the guy we talked about who does this with Bob Noyce, says our amount that we can do will double every 18 months.
Okay. So who won the Nobel Prize for that?
Kilby wins the Nobel Prize, but only because Noyce is dead. And so Kilby is one of these great, people like sharing credit. He said Noyce would have won this had he been there. Their lawyers have spent 15 years fighting over who has a patent for the microchip. But it ends up being an irrelevant case because before the lawyers, goes, appeals. Kilby and Noyce and all get together and say, let's just share it. And they share intellectual property. Kilby wins the Nobel Prize. He has one of the great sharing lines that I think we should all listen to in this town, which is he's introduced at the Nobel Prize as the person who launched the entire digital age by creating the microchip, and explains that Noyce and others deserve it. And he says, I feel a little bit like what the beaver said to the rabbit at the foot of the Hoover Dam. The beaver said, no, I didn't actually build it, but it's based on an idea of mine.
So the microchip is a nice thing, and it starts many different things, but then some people say there's something that you could do that's even better than the microchip, called the microprocessor. What is a microprocessor?
Well, when you can etch transistors and other things on a circuit onto a chip, it finally dawns on them at Intel, because they were having trouble with the Japanese, which is something I guess was, they were supposed to make a chip with a whole lots of different chips that would do things, that they could put the entire processing unit of what would be a computer onto one chip. So it's just a microchip that doesn't just have transistors and circuits, it is the guts of a computer, the processing unit.
And that really revolutionized so many things, because on this little chip you have in effect a computer, right?
And it's amazing. So this chip comes out, and you got some hobbyist, yo-yo, who's a fun guy named Ed Roberts in Albuquerque, who's making backyard rocket ship things. And he sees a microprocessor. He says, hey, I know what hobbyists want. They want a little computer. He makes something called the Altair. Simultaneously, that Altair and that microprocessor come to the Homebrew Computer Club in California, which is a whole lot of geeks who hang around once a month. They call themselves the Homebrew Computer. And they look, Steve Wozniak, this chubby kid who's dropped out 3 times or 4 times, looks at the specs for this microprocessor that Intel has made, says, wait, I can build an even better computer. And he writes all the specs for it, and he gives it out to every member of the Homebrew Computer Club. But he's got this young kid from down the street who hangs around with him named Steve Jobs. And Steve says, Woz, don't give it away for free. We can go to my dad's garage and make these things and sell them. And so they make 400 of these things, and that's how Apple is born. At that exact same time, it appears on the cover of Popular Electronics. Paul Allen is just hanging out in Cambridge, Mass. Goes to that out-of-town news stand thing right in Harvard Square. It's a slushy January day. And he sees this, and he runs all the way to Courier House, where his friend Bill Gates is like, sophomore, and says, look, this is happening. They've now made a microprocessor. It's going to happen without us. Bill Gates drops out and moves to Albuquerque to work on that machine and then forms Microsoft. All from that notion that you can put a processor on a chip.
Well, what you say in your book, which obviously is true, and I assume it came from Bill Gates, is that he famously had a pattern when he was at Harvard of auditing any course he wanted to, but made sure that those courses occurred at the same time that the courses he was supposed to be taking. So as any course he was taking for credit, he would never go to the course, and he would audit courses, and he didn't really pay a lot of attention to, let's say, his academic pursuits then, but he was working on this, and at the time when the Altair came out, you report in your book, Bill Gates had a very high, squeaky voice, and he didn't really look like an adult in a suit, so they weren't sure how they could convince the Ed Roberts that they should actually be given the right to produce software for this computer. This computer, the Altair computer, was a nice little computer, but it didn't really have software. So can you relate how they convinced him?
Well, first of all, Paul Allen at that time could at least grow sideburns, if not a full facial hair, whereas Bill couldn't. And secondly, his voice had deepened, even though Bill was a sophomore at Harvard, he was still squeaky. But Bill actually knew what he was doing, so they have to try to convince this guy, Ed Roberts, to let him come down to write BASIC for this. By the way, it's not just for the Altair. They have the cleverest thing, which ends up screwing IBM, which is, if we write it for this, we'll write it for the microprocessor, and other people will make it, and we'll own it, so it'll work for any computer that gets built. But they have to convince Ed Roberts to let them do it first for the Altair. And so I guess what they do is they have Bill, I you remember this better. Bill calls and pretends to be Paul?
No, what happened was
I haven't read
Bill,
the book.
Bill calls and uses his deep voice.
Bill uses
and he says, I'm Paul Allen.
Because they're going to send Paul
Allen
down. Because they need somebody who doesn't look like a 12-year-old if he says, yes, come to Albuquerque. So Bill calls because he understands how to write the BASIC. He tries to use a deep voice, says, I'm Paul Allen. And Ed Roberts says, the first person who walks through my door with basic coding gets the contract. And so Bill blows off his exam period that January. He uses the Mark I and then the deck that's been put at Harvard by the Defense Department. He gets ad boarded, which, as you know, means you get called before the punishment board at Harvard for having stolen too much computer time and signed on his friend Paul Allen. So was Mark Zuckerberg. I wish I had been ad boarded. I might be successful now. But so anyway, they do write it during that reading period and exam period.
And they move down to Albuquerque ultimately, and they're doing work there. But ultimately, they go back to Seattle to start their company. And probably the biggest mistake in the history of computer negotiations, IBM is looking for somebody that can provide software for their IBM PC and ultimately the operating system. And IBM said, well, who cares about the software, the operating system? We'll just license it from this little company in Seattle. How did that come about?
Well, it's just like when they figured out with the Altair, if we create the operating system for this chip and we keep the rights to it, everybody else who uses that chip will have to get our BASIC. In this case, it was DOS, the operating system. And, as I said earlier, the boys with their toys building the hardware, they don't quite realize that the operating system is going to be the be-all and end-all, that the hardware will be commoditized, but if you use Windows or DOS or whatever. And so Bill goes down to, I think it's Orlando or somewhere in Florida, where they have to meet with the team that's doing
Boca Raton,
where they're doing the IBM PC. And he just, thank you. This is, that's right. He convinces them, gives them a pretty good deal on the licensing, but says we own it and we get to license it and to other people. And so that's why IBM in the end gets screwed, that the PC business between the Dells and the Compacts and the HPs has become a commodity. They're all just doing it based on price, whereas the operating system, you rule the roost.
Well, Microsoft was a tiny, tiny company, and when IBM was going to unveil their PC, they were briefing the CEO of IBM about all the people supplying the parts, and they were describing one company that was called Microsoft. And how did the IBM CEO react to that?
Well, I think he's with Mary Gates, the mom of, and Mary Gates was one of these grand Seattle people who was on the board, national board, I think, of the United Way, with head of IBM, and she says, that's my son doing that. And then when it's brought up, and he says, well, I didn't know we were doing it. So Mary Gates goes back and tells Bill, hey, you're bragging on all this stuff. You dropped out of college, and this guy at IBM's never heard of you. And then eventually it gets up to the big planning committee, and John Opel, I think it is, who's running on, and says, oh yeah, that's Mary Gates' son. Right. And I don't know if it got them the contract, but it got them credibility.
But so in the end, if IBM had said, we want to own the operating system and we want to own the software you're producing, we wouldn't be hearing about Bill Gates and his great fortune, I assume. Is that right?
No, I think you're right. I mean, obviously Bill Gates could have invented something else. He was a great programmer, and he was at the time also programming for Apple. Right. He was the biggest programmer for Steve and Steve at Apple. But that's probably the biggest business break in the history of computing, is convince IBM to let you own their operating system.
So let's shift to the internet. Did Al Gore or somebody else?
I actually try to defend Al Gore here, since he never said he invented it. But
what did he say? He said
I was there at the,
He said I created it.
I helped create the opening of the internet, whatever, they created the internet.
Right.
To start with him and give him his due, the internet was not that big of a deal when it was only connecting National Science Foundation researchers and Defense Department researchers. In 1991, 92, and 93, and I will give Bill Markey credit too, because he's, I think, working for Al then, or that, was Markey working for Gore then, or just?
No, they were colleagues on the
committee. So Gore was a senator, and
No.
Gore was in the Congress, House.
They're both in the House, and
yes, and they were on the telecommunications.
Yeah, but by the time 92 comes around, Gore is a senator, right? And
Ed is chairman of telecom.
Ed is chairman of telecom, and they create the Gore, called the Gore-Markey Act of 1991, 92, and 93, which does many things, but the most important thing is it opens up the internet so that normal people can get on it. You don't have to be a government researcher.
But one of the urban myths is that the internet was really invented to enable the U.S. government to be able to survive a nuclear attack. Is that true or not?
Yeah, like many things, it is both true and false. It's a quantum theory where you can be in two places. Originally, the Pentagon decides it wants a network that can survive a nuclear attack. And a guy named Paul Barron out at RAND invents something called packet switching, which means you take all information, you break it into really small chunks, you put a header block on it, and you send it scurrying through a network in which there's no central hub, but there's just many, many nodes, each of which knows how to forward it based on the address header. And if you bomb one of the nodes, it doesn't matter, it knows how to route around it. The graduate students who then get assigned to help build ARPANET, which is the predecessor of the internet, create a packet switch, decentralized, distributed network like that. They have half of them, I mean, this is the early 1970s and stuff, they're there because they're avoiding having to serve in Vietnam. They're staying in graduate school. They are not trying to deal with a Cold War problem. They just want to take power back from authority. They're kind of rebellious. And so they're creating this system largely because there's no centralized command and control of the internet. There's no one switch or hub.
But the idea was to connect the various computer networks to get them to be able to talk to each other, because they had different computer networks they didn't share. But why is it that Vincent Cerf and Bob Kahn are often said to be the inventors of the internet?
I'm actually doing an event, which this afternoon, at Google with Vint and Bob Kahn, Vint Cerf and Bob Kahn, and that'll be streamed. So after you watch this, you can watch Google streaming this one, which answers that question. Early on, they had to do two things. First, with the ARPANET, all these graduate students had to find a way to get the routers, which they called imps, to connect to the host computers, and there was no rules for it, and so they just created a set of rules, protocols for it. And they didn't want to impose it, because as I said, these are people who don't like authority being opposed down. So they do it with what they call requests for comment. Whenever they have an idea and they want it to happen, instead of saying, here's how you're supposed to connect this address header to that, they say, here's an idea, a request for comment. And so that builds up to be the rules for the original ARPANET. About 10, 12 years later, you have ARPANET, National Science Foundation Net, many other networks, and they don't interconnect. So somebody says we need to have instead of all these networks, we need to have an internetworking protocol. And that's where the word internet comes from, which is how do you make all these networks talk. So the protocols are invented by a guy named Inventors, who's still around, and Google down the street, and Bob Kahn. And all they do is, with a whole lot of input from their friends, figure out ways to do all those TCP/IP things that you don't have to look at much anymore.
So there's another person who gets credit for the World Wide Web. That's Tim Berners-Lee. What did he actually do?
So the internet is just a set of protocols for sending things around. It is very difficult to use up until 92, 93, 94 when Berners-Lee does the web. Because you have to type in, I can still remember typing in weird commands and Gopher and SynFetch, and you don't know how to find things on this internet. We were mostly doing it through AOL, which would help organize for us. Then Tim Berners-Lee, working at CERN, the Swiss particle accelerator, says, I've got to organize this information. I'm going to take a system of hyperlinks, which means if you just have a word and you want to link it to some other document or you want to go somewhere, we will have this whole system of hyperlinks, and he calls it the World Wide Web, and that becomes a way of using the internet.
So, but it still wasn't readily available for the average person. So somebody named Mark Andreessen came up with something called Mosaic. What was Mosaic?
Mosaic was just a very easy to use browser. And I remember when I was by then running New Media for Time Incorporated, and it was hard to sort of figure out how to use the web. This browser came along from University of Illinois, where Andreessen was just a student, sort of a big hulking corn-fed student, and he makes it really easy to just put this piece of software on your computer, and it becomes very graphical, and you can navigate the web.
Just as an aside, I would say I didn't understand it then either very much, and James Clark, who had been the CEO of Silicon Graphics, showed up in my office one day with a kid in jeans and sandals, and this kid, he was supposed to be a very smart kid, he invented something they were calling Mosaic, and they were trying to describe what it does. They wanted to have us invest at a valuation of about $100 million. And we said, hey, look, we're not idiots. We're not going to put a $100 million valuation on something that has no revenue or earnings, so get out of here. And of course, they later built a company that was pretty successful, Netscape. So anyway, that was our mistake. But anyway, we made a lot of mistakes. So
fewer than most.
So let me ask you. So people can go on the internet and they can browse and so forth. But what is it that Google actually did that really made?
I think Google ties it together because you can browse, and I remember when we first were using the web, people had Pathfinder. We invented Time Inc. to show people where to go if you want news. Here's place, but you couldn't really search. I think the whole thing comes together with Google, the whole history of the digital age, because it combines human judgments with machine algorithms. And what Larry Page and Sergey Brin did was find out a way to do a search engine, which would crawl around the web, look at links that people had made, so that if I searched David Rubenstein, if I searched New Orleans Saints or whatever, it would rank the pages based on how many people had given links and how important the people who had given those links were, and suddenly you could find almost instantly anything you wanted anywhere.
Okay. So somebody who wanted to create something like that was Jimmy Wales, and he came up with something called Wikipedia. How did that work, and where did the Wiki name come from?
Wiki came from the bus at the Honolulu airport, which if you had to get somewhere fast, it was called the Wiki. And so Ward Cunningham named a piece of software the Wiki, and Jimmy Wales was trying to create an encyclopedia online. And it had people who contributed to it, but it was a really clunky process, and everybody was being vetted. And somebody said, why don't we just try, just as a beta test, putting this wiki software on, and anybody who wants to can contribute. And I remember early on working on the Einstein entry on it, and the odd thing is people collaborate for free, without getting credit, and people can write stupid things, but it's easy to revert it. And the wisdom of crowds ends up overcoming the stupidity of a few people who want to mess it up.
So let me conclude with just talking about the combination of arts and sciences and humanistic views and technology. People know you as a very talented writer and somebody that has written a lot of books. I mentioned 8 books, and also somebody that really is very deeply involved in the cultural life of our country. But what you reveal in your book is that actually, as a young boy, you spent all your time soldering things in your father's workshop because your father was an electrical engineer. So how did you, I can't picture you putting things together in Heath kits, but can you describe that?
Well, yeah, well, I mean, I think that if you look at most people in this book, they actually love to fiddle with hobbies in the basement, and most of them electronic hobbies. And, you know, when I was young, I remember we still had vacuum tubes in the radio, and Dad would say, the radio's not working, figure out which tube is burned out and go buy a new one. You test the tubes. And so you learned how a circuit worked. And then eventually we had Heath kits, and you'd say, okay, and here's the schematic, and you put a transistor, a resistor here, and a capacitor that does this. And you got a feel for how it worked. And I loved ham radios. I was WA5, John Thomas Peter, you know, that was my handle. And I realized that that helped form communities, virtual communities. And ham radios and building Heath kits is simply what we're doing today, but you got to put hands-on to it.
So the next 5 or 10 years, what do you think is likely to be the greatest technology advance in this kind of area that we're going to see? What can be done in the internet or with computers?
I think there'll be new forms of, when I did this book, I put it online to have people collaborate as if it were a wiki. And so Stuart Brand adds some stuff about the demise of the Whole Earth catalog, and Dan Bricklin puts in VisiCalc and how he did it. And so it was done more collaboratively. It's still not a good process. I would love someday to write a collaborative book where I sort of try to curate it a bit, but let's say we're on Louis Armstrong, and then you say, okay, put in the music, have somebody play the music, have Wynton Marsalis say, here's how our first, and everybody can contribute. It would demand, and this is something you could figure out, a Bitcoin-like payment system so we could all share the royalties and whatever. But I do think collaborative creativity is the next big thing.
Okay. Well, for those who haven't read the book, and it's only out 3 days, I strongly recommend
boy,
it.
You've read it.
I have read it.
It's
It's a great book. It'll be on the New York Times bestseller list very shortly, I'm sure. And it's a really good look into how the technology that we all use and take for common use now came about and developed, and really through a lot of happenstance, but a lot of brilliant people working on these things. So thank you for the public service of doing
and I'm
it.
happy to sign. And, very